So let me begin. I'm Martha McIver and from the Center for Social Organization of Schools, and we want to welcome everyone to a very special edition of what has been a monthly research forum that we have done together as a center with our faculty and postdocs and students. But for this particular event, we wanted to invite a much broader range of the School of Education. I think we have people from outside the School of Education, and we're very delighted that you're here to share in this presentation by our colleague, Dr. Richard Lofton. And I'm going to turn it over to Professor Otis Johnson now to introduce Dr. Lofton and his entire research team.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Lofton, for inviting me to have the great honor of introducing you and your team of the Nobody Asked Me campaign. And from the beginning, the Nobody Asked Me campaign wanted to give voice to the students, their families, the communities, that rely on Baltimore City Public Schools and just their cities and the resources and opportunities in general to move forward and move past some of the things, some of the obstacles that students are facing daily. And so Dr. Lofton and his vision and his team have helped us imagine what that future and what that possibility may be. And he's had a broad base of support, including from the president's office to the Bloomberg American Health Initiative, and then also from the Center for Safe and Healthy Schools. So we're delighted to be partnering with Dr. Lofton on this vision. And his team has really done what's needed to be done for quite a while. I've been in some of these meetings where the voices of the students that have been captured through the Nobody Asked Me campaign have just given a texture and a feel and an importance to the subject matter, whether it's talking about school finance and the fact that Baltimore City schools have been underfunded for a while in terms of their facilities, which is work also led by Josh Sharfstein. To other concerns about safety, well-being, the health, not just educational outcomes, but the actual livelihood of our next generation, our future. So Dr. Lofton and his team have been collecting data, getting interviews of a large number of them so that we can know exactly from the students and the families and the community's perspective what we need to be doing to make things better. So I want to thank him and his team, and then also introduce the other people contributing to the good trouble that Nobody Asked Me campaign is bringing forward for Baltimore. And that's Larry C. Simmons, he's Director of Community Engagement. Dr. Josh Shusky is also on the team. Dr. Emily Clark, researcher and project coordinator. And then Joseph Boslovic is a doctoral student in sociology, but also one of the important contributors to the Nobody Asked Me campaign. Corinne DeFranceschi is also a research assistant. And there are several other research assistants. I would just name them all quickly. Melissa Ueri, Jakara D'Souza, Emily Diaz was already mentioned, Lisa Nearing, Aaron Thomas, and Thompson, and Justin Hill. So I think I've gone through the entire team, and I want to just give them all my sense of gratitude and excitement for the work that you've done and that you will continue to do, and the impact that you will make for Baltimore's children. So with that, I will introduce turn it over to Dr. Lofton, who's a principal investigator and also assistant professor in the School of Education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for that amazing introduction. And thank you, Martha McIver, for that welcoming. I am extremely grateful today. I'm grateful because we are at a point where we can actually share some of our findings with you. We want to say it's been a struggle, but it's been a good struggle. And as Otis have said, we have gotten into a lot of good trouble, and we will continue to get into good trouble if it's about empowering people and humanizing them. So I'm excited for this opportunity. I'm excited to be working with so many amazing people. And so I think we should just get into it. Our overall presentation, we're going to talk about mission, purpose, and practice, co-creating research and knowledge, bearing strange fruit, continuing to bear and consume strange fruit, and also cultivating healthy fruit. So that's what we're going to kind of highlight today. And we're going to first start off, we're really getting an understanding of the Nobody Asked Me campaign. We make it very simple. Our work is all about empowering people and humanizing people so they can feel their goals and move beyond surviving to striving. And we do that, we believe we can do this by actually illuminating the voices and the experiences of people in Baltimore. We're excited because for so long, policies, strategies, and interventions have not been about co-creating, but it's about telling people what they need to do in order to empower their lives. We believe that's the wrong way to go. That to actually, we actually believe that you have to talk and work with community and understand knowledges, understand intelligence, understand different forms of being and interacting in the world. And what make our work so different from many other research teams is that we, at our core, believe that in order to bring about change in Baltimore, that we have to co-produce knowledge, strategies, and policies. We try to do this in many different ways. I'm going to need these slides to be, I can barely read them, so I'm going to need them to, how do we do this? Because I want to make sure that everyone is able to fully understand and see our slides. Can we make the slides bigger? As we are trying to make the slides bigger, because I will
Dr.
like.
Lofton,
Mhm.
Dr. Lofton, I can see them fine.
Okay, you can see them fine?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm kind of concerned about myself because I'm the
It's a good idea.
speaker, but I appreciate you for saying that. So let me see.
Is there a way that I can like zoom off the presentation slide? Because I'm trying to figure out if I can just.
Okay, I can see it bigger now.
Okay.
All right. So first, illuminate and humanize the voices and experiences of youth and their families. Co-produce knowledge, strategies, and policies, interventions, and theories. Be at the forefront at producing rigorous qualitative research through our review of literature, methodology, critical analysis, and genre of writing, and also build powerful relationships within Baltimore to make sure that we connect our understanding with mayor, elected officials, and community members and school district leaders. Our work is about humanizing everyone and making sure that we do not put blame on our mayor. We don't put blame on our superintendent. We don't put blame on Black students and Black mothers, that there's a larger thing going on. And we wanted to take that into account when we're thinking about how do we collectively co-produce strategies, policies, and interventions to empower Baltimoreans. What we practice. So not only do we want to have an ideology that actually transforms, we want to practice this. And how do we do this? We believe in breaking down silos, right? Not only that, we understand that in many ways that we have bought into anti-Blackness and other forms of discrimination for many, many, many years, and making sure that we call attention to that in a way to actually empower people and humanize people. Also, we know it takes a village, right? That working with each other to humanize each other through love, belonging, care, and joy. These are natural humanistic characteristics, but there's some reason that it's so hard for so many of our institutions to allow that to occur from the people who are actually in them. And so that's something that we really want to highlight and make sure we understand and produce environments so that can occur. But not only that, we believe that we must have to address not only humanizing, but acknowledging that humans need funding and resources in their home, schools, and communities, as well as through government agencies. That's about making sure that our students and our parents and Baltimoreans have the resources and opportunities that they need in order to thrive in our city. We are excited because we move outside of academia. We love Hopkins, but we know in order to really address the issues that we are concerned about, we have to move outside of Hopkins and make sure that we connect with interagencies, with people who are thinking in ways to really empower each other. And we are working with Baltimore Public Schools, the Family League, the Children and Family Success, and many other groups and organizations in Baltimore. I'm excited about my team. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for introducing them. And I'm excited to show you a research team where there's representation. There's gays and lesbians. There are Blacks and there are white. There are males and there are females. There's undergrads, masters, and PhD students. There's doctors, as well as community organizers, community activists, and organic intellectuals. One of the big takeaways that I want to leave with the School of Education is we have to move beyond our comfort zone. We have to move beyond having research teams, departments, program where everyone looks like each other. Because it's a college, I always say, if you are part of a department or organization or a research team and it looks like a sorority or a fraternity, you're not humanizing and you do not have an equity lens. So I encourage people to really think through how you are co-producing knowledge in ways to empower people. I'm going to hand it over to Larry.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As we move into kind of talking about the co-creation of knowledge and interventions, this really excites me, right? This marriage of community and academia really getting together to work for what we all love and care about, and that's young people in Baltimore City. Next slide, thanks. And so we aimed to interview over 150 young people and their families. Currently, we are at about 98 interviews, and I believe that by early next week, we will have reached our goal. And so the selection criteria was pretty simple. You had to be a current or former Baltimore City Public School student, the family members, or a family member of a Baltimore City Public School or former student between the ages of 14 and 24 years old. And in families, there were really no age requirements. We reached out and connected through Baltimore City Public Schools Family Fun Festivals. Richard and I spent some Saturdays at grocery stores and other community events, really trying to connect with young people. We also spent some time in Baltimore City Public Schools connecting and recruiting young people as well. And through that recruiting and connecting, we were able to connect with a large, I would say like a large catchment of Baltimore City, right? A good representation of students and families throughout the city. And these charts will just kind of show you which zip codes and neighborhoods we really got into. And it's kind of hard for me to see as well. But as you can see, there is a large representation of our city through different zip codes. And from the literature we reviewed and from the conversations and interviews from young people, there were 4 major themes that arose. And the interesting thing about these themes are that they're not uncommon, that these are conversations that are happening throughout the city and in different spaces, but this kind of puts validity to it. And this is really coming from young people. And those 4 strategy areas are fulfilling the promise, safety and violence, transportation, and school infrastructure. We'll be spending some time today on the data around school infrastructure. But I want to say that these conversations that have already started with the strategy groups have been some of the best conversations I've been in over the last couple of weeks. This relationship building that's happening between academics, community folks, and programmers, folks who are right there in the mix with young people, has been really inspiring over these last couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. And before we move on, just for clarification on my side, is that we not only believe that's important to collect data and give it back to academia, we believe it is important for us to not only come up with the problems, but make students and parents agents of their own change. And we have produced not only qualitative data to support that, but we also have produced strategy groups where we have Hopkins experts, as well as community activists, as well as, as Larry was saying, different people throughout Baltimore to really come up with solutions or strategies and co-produce in these strategy groups. And we have 4 of them that Larry just mentioned. All right, let's move on.
Thank you.
In this slide, we wanted to highlight the Constitution of Maryland, and the first section of it states, "The General Assembly at its first session after the adoption of this Constitution shall by law establish throughout the state a thorough and efficient system of free public schools, and shall provide by taxation or otherwise for their maintenance." And this section was important to emphasize since this Constitution is meant to guarantee thorough and efficient public education for students. However, as we've seen throughout multiple interviews, this has not always been the case. On this slide, we have a quote from the mayor of Baltimore in 1910, J. Barry Mahul, who said, "Blacks should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance, to prevent the spread of communicable disease into the nearby white neighborhoods, and to protect property values among the white majority." And this shows the views that were held about the Black population in Baltimore at this time, and how there was a lot of ignorance and discrimination against them.
We wanted to open up a conversation to actually get feedback from everyone later on. And this is a conversation I'm having with my directors, Director of Research, Josh, as well as Larry. And one of the things that we do is sit around and talk and try to make sense of the data. And so we actually want to invite you in to a conversation right now that we have in order to get some type of understanding of our data. And so we're going to use this example of what the mayor said in order to understand what's happening in our schools today. Josh, you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Richard, and everybody else who spoke already today. So yeah, we really wanted to jump into this idea of strange fruit, right? The classic Billie Holiday song around the lynching of Black folks, and the ways in which now we see this happening structurally, right? And so this idea of like structural violence, mundane violence, right? And so we really wanted to highlight the words of the former mayor, and you see the words communicable disease, quarantine, isolated slums, and right? And I think it's hard to disentangle those words from what we're experiencing right now with COVID, right? And the ways in which Black people have been sheltered off and put off into these other ways as inherently disease ridden or biologically inferior, right? And we see how these words kind of play out, and then what that ultimately looks like structurally, right? When we think about segregation and we think about unequal opportunity for resources and things like that. So those are kind of the initial thoughts that were going around as me, Larry, and Richard were having this discussion. And so I just wanted Larry too to kind of jump in.
Yeah, and then it's also this power exchange, right? Like when I guess when you have never had power, right, and now someone is asking you, what would you do to change Baltimore, or what would you do if you had this? Those questions are really difficult for some young people because they haven't been in that space to think of what would I do, right? Because I've never had it to even think about it. And a part of this conversation that we've been having around this is just like this continuance of violence and hurt that happens to young people all the time, where sometimes they don't even realize it's happening, right? It's just a part of what's going on in my community, what's going on in my school.
And just to add to everything, agreeing with everything, is this quarantine. And I think in Baltimore, people have been very successful with that, right? And this idea of separating African Americans, but not only separating their bodies, but their ideologies, their knowledge, their ways of being. But not only that, quarantine, we know already, we see this with the racial segregation, right? That's a mechanism. We also see it, when we think about the allocation of resources. We also see it in so many places. But not only that, that protect property, I think is so important as well. Yeah. Where there's a distinction when it comes to Blackness, right? And Blackness is always at risk. Blackness is always aggressive and angry. Blackness is always looked upon as needing to be saved, right? And this anti-Blackness that we often hear, even from many African Americans, when it's always a blame to something, when it's actually deeper, it's deeply rooted in this strange fruit.
So just kind of to illustrate what the roots of this strange fruit, kind of some of those examples is the history of underfunding within Baltimore City Public Schools. So I think one of the things to take away from this slide is how long the history of underfunding spans. So it spans at this point 3 decades of continuous underfunding. So we saw it starting with the 1996 case of Bradford versus Maryland State Board of Education, where the court declared that Baltimore City schools in particular, but Maryland school systems were, the Maryland State of Education was violating its own constitution that we saw highlighted in the first section of this presentation, where the notion of a thorough and efficient education has been consistently violated, and the court declared this since 1996. So from then, it's been a long history of declaring that the state was continuously violating its own standards. Baltimore City schools in particular were continuously underfunded with an education gap. So this gap kind of explained how much schools were underfunded. So in 2001, there was a overall evaluation of funding in Maryland's schools, and they found that there was almost a $3,380 budget per student that was needed in schools that wasn't being met. And as the years went by, this adequacy gap continued to increase. And so that meant that the standard that was set to provide a thorough and efficient education was also meant that the state had to comply with changing educational standards and educational costs to meet a contemporary education. And so as the year went by, because the state had failed to meet adequate education standards through funding. It meant that each year that passed with continuous underfunding, schools, especially Baltimore City schools, were not only meeting contemporary education standards, but they were not even closing the gap of adequate funding. And so that's kind of what this slide illustrates. And I think one of the important things to take away from this slide is that with the visual of strange fruit, the roots and the leaves, it's that the history of underfunding has made it so that students, especially because Baltimore City Schools is among in the district the most underfunded, but also has low income, a large majority of low income families, and a lot of them are Black and Brown families. So this means that with the history of underfunding, even with attempts to remedy the situation, so with like the Bridge to Excellence Act, or funding formulas that changed over time to try and address the funding situation, because the gap was consistently not closed, it meant that those students who were already at a disadvantage economically, so Brown and Black families were consistently underfunded at a disadvantage from the very beginning. So I think that's one of the most important things to take away from this particular slide.
Yeah, so if we turn to sort of what the literature says about the physical conditions of schools, there's a number of ways that infrastructure has sort of been operationalized. We can think about the indoor environmental quality. So these are indicators related to thermal comfort, air quality, light, noise. It can be operationalized in the way of number of custodians, square footage per student, sort of ownership of space, and sort of if schools are in need of structural repair. So we've organized the outcomes that have been related to school infrastructure into 4 sort of like overlapping buckets of academic achievement, absenteeism, learning, and health. I would say that in terms of academic achievement, all the sort of, manifestations of achievement like test scores and grades have been related to poor infrastructure, have been sort of associated with infrastructure variables, but it's also worth noting that students' sort of self-worth and academic competency, and they're sort of the way that they're thinking they're being valued in the community. So these variables related to their identity are also have been related to the conditions of schools. When we think about absenteeism, so in addition to the days that might be lost because schools are actually closed because of infrastructure related issues. So thinking about schools that are closed because it's too hot or too cold. So in addition to those sort of learning opportunities that are lost, poor condition has been associated with more absences and more dropouts in high school. And then if we zoom into sort of like the classroom physical environment, there's studies that sort of relate the, noise or sort of organization or clutter that's in these environments with the cognitive load that students have to sort of work against in order to keep learning going. There's also studies that sort of relate temperatures, whether it's, temperatures that are too hot or too cold, to student performance. So we're sort of seeing that without that sort of thermal comfort or thermal control, our classrooms are not as efficient. And then health, literally the physical health of our students. When we think about a population of students that is disproportionately affected by asthma, poor ventilation, any instance of mold, or if we're sort of in too hot or too cold temperature conditions, these symptoms are irritated and, may cause either further absence or sort of in interaction with what's happening in terms of learning. I will say that, this is mostly centered around students' experiences. And I think that what we're going to be hearing in terms of initial findings will reflect that student experience. But it's also worth noting that teachers are also affected by these conditions. There's studies that are linking, infrastructure with teacher turnover, teacher job satisfaction, teachers' health and wellness. So, as much as teachers sort of have to fight against their built environment, that's going to be manifest in the way that, students and teachers are going to be conducting their business in their classrooms.
Mm-hmm. And the point to this slide is this: physical conditions of schools matter, right? The social scientific research shows that it matters. Right? Academic achievement, absenteeism, health, and learning. It matters. So this is something that we do not take lightly. It matters in the literature, but later on, you're going to hear how students say it matters in their lives.
So where we're at right now, so with the Kerwin Commission that was started in 2016. So this commission was established to try and address the changing landscape of education. So with the focus on creating 21st century education. But unfortunately, with the report of this commission, it continued to show that Baltimore City schools were underfunded by almost a $2 billion need that still existed from decades previous. And so this new focus on 21st century education, while it provides high standards for the state of Maryland's education system, it also means that the proposed budget is not equitable to address the longstanding underfunding that Baltimore City Schools has suffered. And so with the Kerwin Commission, they've proposed a blueprint plan, which is going to start implementation. So it's going to start building new programs, increasing educational resources in schools. And this plan is only going to start implementation this year. So there was quite a big delay in between 2016 until 2022. And one of the things that happened in between that time, as we know, is the pandemic. And the pandemic has exacerbated what was already not going well in schools. And we know that the pandemic has disproportionately affected Black and Brown families, Black and Brown children, and their education. So this means that with the underfunding in Baltimore City schools that had already existed prior to the pandemic, it meant that kids in schools couldn't get the resources that they needed to benefit from a virtual education or a shift to a virtual education during the pandemic. And so it means a lot of the students didn't have computers, they didn't have access to quality internet in order to follow their classes online. So again, this kind of made a bad situation worse. So this is kind of where we're at. And I think this quote, "The state has never tackled the overall problem. And as a result, tens of thousands of children attend constitutionally inadequate schools each day and every year." And I think, as Dr. Lofton mentioned, it isn't about blame, but it is important to recognize that students have been shortchanged for decades. And then in addition, they're not able to advance to the same level and to hit that target of 21st century education and those high standards of education that we're looking for now.
Thank you so much for that history and that literature review, Melissa and Lisa. So much of what both of you all talked about leans into a lot of the work that one of our colleagues, one of our collaborators has done an amazing work on. And so it's my pleasure to introduce my fellow Dr. Josh S., Dr. Josh Sharfstein, to present his findings around, school replacement values and facility and funding. So continuing to bear strange fruit as findings around school infrastructure. Dr. Sharfstein, it is all you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to this discussion. So I'm going to just show a few of the slides from some of the work that we're doing to understand the relative conditions of Baltimore City schools and equity between different school systems. But there's sort of a little bit of a meta conversation because I'm going to show you how things are usually presented and like another way of looking at it too. So just to start, this is the typical way of presenting the average adjusted age of K-12 facilities by county in Maryland. And so adjusted age just means like if part of the school has been renovated, they adjust for that a little bit. That's the idea. So they kind of average the school in proportion to what space has been renovated. But it's basically a measure of the age of the school. And you can see Baltimore City is the third oldest in the state by this measure. But another way of looking at it's on the next slide, which is where are all the extra years? Because Baltimore has a lot of schools. And so if you look at it by the number of extra years, Prince George's and Baltimore City are basically have 75% of the years past the average. And Howard County and Montgomery County have nearly 1,000 years under the average. I hope that makes sense. One way to think about it doesn't make sense. Let's drive around the state of Maryland and count up the years that are above the average age. If you do that, you're driving a lot in Prince George's County and Baltimore City to get those years. And now let's collect those years in our car and let's drop them off at the more recently built buildings. And we're dropping those years off by and large in Howard and Montgomery County. So you can see that one way to look at it is just by the average, but that obscures a very, very clear disparity in the age of the school districts. You'd have to find 1,000 years less in Baltimore to bring it down to average. Montgomery County could do 1,000 years older schools and it would be still below average. Next slide. Also, we've gotten some pretty interesting data about how old the components of schools are. And so if you just ask the question that for the components of schools in different districts that are 30 years past their expected lifespan, like this is a roof that was supposed to be replaced 30 years ago or a wall that was supposed to be replaced 30 years ago, according to an assessment that was made of that particular unit. Baltimore City just dominates the state in how much that they have that's more than 30 years past the lifespan. And you can see, I think that's like close to $150 million worth of actual value of the components if you were to buy it now. And of course, if you go to 20 years and 10 years, it's even bigger, but Baltimore really dominates as you get the number of years out. Next slide. This is another slide that's been presented a lot in the state. And it basically the state calculated what it called the Facilities Condition Index of every school in Maryland, which is sort of a measure of the remaining useful life of the school. And they presented it, you can't really see it, but if you see the brighter red line, that's the state average. And you go up 2 lines, that's Baltimore City, and you can see lower is better. So the state has said that if you look at the remaining useful life for Baltimore City schools, it's actually better in Baltimore than the state average, which is a bit of a head scratcher based on what I just showed you. But the reason for that is that the average, of course, brings together some brand new schools in Baltimore with all the old schools in Baltimore. And the purpose of this score is to find the schools that need to be replaced, not to find an average. So if you actually ask the question, I think the right way, you get what's on the next slide. The number of schools in poor condition, and Baltimore City and Prince George's County dominate there too. And that is basically a very low remaining useful life. Next slide. Then there's this concept called replacement value. So the replacement value is what it would cost to get a new one of what you have now. And so some equipment, like it's a built-up roof, is a certain value, but some other types of roofs are much more expensive. So one way to think about the replacement value is, you have a car, but is it a Pinto or is it a Cadillac? And so in this statewide survey, you could actually look and see, well, where are the Pinto supplies and where are the Cadillac supplies across the state? Next slide. So this is what we found on a per square foot basis by county. Baltimore City has the lowest replacement value per square foot, which means its equipment is, somewhat lower per square foot in the city compared to others. And then if you go to the next slide, I'm going to show it to you sort of the way I showed the other one, which is, let's actually look for where there is cheaper equipment in total, not look on average. And here you can see Baltimore City is way under. It's almost off the map, really, in terms of the stuff that it has at its schools. And this is on the ballpark, I think, of $300 million less replacement value than other counties, than the average. If all of them had the same, then Baltimore City would have $300 million more of replacement value. It's just another way of getting a sense of just the inequity that exists in school construction. If you look particularly, I think, at HVAC systems on the next slide. Oh, maybe I didn't give you the HVAC slides. So why is this? In part, this is because of very seriously inequitable funding for capital projects. This is just an example from fiscal year 2020, where you can see that Baltimore County, Montgomery, and Anne Arundel are able to afford much larger local shares for capital funding. And so the amount of money going to the counties is much less in Baltimore City. And ultimately, you add that up over years and you get these problems with like profound differences in the quality of the schools. So some of this is preliminary analysis. We have just gotten a whole new updated data set that we're working on. We'll be able to look at a bunch of other questions about this too. And what it adds up to, is my last sentence, is that the state is actually going through a process of putting these schools in line for replacement. And it's really important that this be done in a way that's fair, I think, both at the school level and at the county level. And so we'll use this analysis to inform whether or not this process is fair and how the fairness can be improved. I think that would be all I would say initially. But thanks so much for having me.
And just to reiterate a couple of points that I think is so important to take away when it comes to that idea of the Pinto and the Cadillac, for us to really think deeply about that. Because from the interviews that we've conducted, many of our students are fully aware of the Pinto, and they have to compete in a world full of Cadillacs, right? And when you think about what is used, what knowledge is used, what information is used to maintain these huge disparities when it comes to the allocation of resources and to get away with it, how at one point it was okay not to really go deep inside and see what's going on in the lives of students, as well as acknowledging many factors that were not acknowledged. So even today, in our way of bringing equity, we want to acknowledge, right, that there's strange fruit and push people to be aware of it. And I'm so serious about this because we have done so many interviews and our students are suffering, right? And so not for any other way, any other value, but to think about what it's doing to our students. And Josh is about to help us understand that.
Thank you so much for that, Richard and Dr. Sharfstein. And so really building off the work of Dr. Sharfstein, we see that, right, Baltimore City school infrastructure is systematically overvalued, right, and underfunded by the state. And so what does all this mean, right? At the end of the day, what are the actual experiences of students who are in these schools, right? And so that's really where the Nobody Asked Me campaign comes in and really elevates the voices and experience of youth in Baltimore. And so through our analyses of the interviews, we came up with 3 emergent themes, right, related to school infrastructure. The first being that there are disrupted learning opportunities and personal experiences that make learning difficult for students. The second one is related to public health and individual well-beings and concerns. So if we return back to the idea of strange fruit and the things that we were talking about earlier, like we are seeing these things manifest again in the lives and the experiences of students in these schools. And then lastly, as Dr. Lofton alluded to, right, students are aware of these disparities in school infrastructure. They are not blindly walking through their communities and their schools and thinking that everything's the same for everybody. They know there is unequal opportunity and unequal resources. And so with that said, going into the first theme, right, there is poor school infrastructure has tangible consequences for students and shapes their experiences and their ability to learn. And so this is a quote from Terry, a 21-year-old who had been through Baltimore City schools. And he says, "You would just be hot. It was terrible. There was a time when I was at City where we were actually, I think all of Baltimore City schools shut down for 4 days because a lot of schools didn't have heat. We had heat at City, but it was broken. And we'd be in class and it'd get 40 degrees. So we were out for 4 days. I think that was pretty bad being in the cold, but I think the heat is even worse. Not having air conditioning. You cannot focus when it's 80 degrees and you're sitting down just like, I sweat a lot. So I would be sweating in class. It was terrible going to school, right? And so, highlighting kind of the words in here around like literally you're missing opportunities to learn because school is literally not in session because of the poor school infrastructure. And then you're talking about just the discomfort of sitting in heat. And that ultimately affects, as, Lisa talked about earlier, right? Their experiences in school. He literally says it's terrible going to school. And so the second thing that we found, right, was that in addition to, how this affects learning, right, poor school infrastructure can be a matter of public health and student well-being, right? And so here, Jess, she's talking about just her experiences, right, and what she's seen in her schools related to public health. And she says, I think they canceled school one time because it got really cold, but there was an issue because one student has some sort of chronic condition where their body doesn't regulate temperature well. So they could die if it's too cold and the school didn't have heating, so they couldn't go. And then school was almost canceled or let out early more than I've heard from anywhere else for it being too hot. So again, Jess is also talking about what we just talked about, missed learning opportunities, but literally there are physical issues of being in these schools that could lead to death or it could lead to chronic conditions and things of that nature that are really a major concern just for the livelihood and well-being of the students in these spaces. And then the third and final point was, right, that we talked about is that students, I'm sorry about that. Hold on, this is actually, I was in the move. This is actually Joseph's part here.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Shuski. Yes, Dr. Shuski was getting into here. The third kind of related theme that we're finding in the data related to school infrastructure so far is that students are aware of disparities in school infrastructure. And you can actually see that in the last quote that Dr. Shuski was talking about. It ends with, and then school was almost canceled or let out early more than I've heard from anywhere else for it being too hot. So again, already you have this idea of students not just seeing what's going on in schools, but then seeing what's going on in their schools in comparison to their other experiences or things they know. So we want to go to the next slide here. And this gives kind of a more concrete example. This is from Kirk, who was 18, talking about just kind of conditions across high schools in Baltimore. And he said, I think it's really common to have kind of poor infrastructure, have issues related to temperature and things like that, saying, especially if you're not in one of those schools that's well talked about or received. If you're not one of those top 4 high schools, then the money being pushed into your school is not going to be as high. Yeah, there were definitely moments where it's like, oh, this is a common issue, but it's not being talked about enough because it's never schools that were really pushed into the limelight. So in this case, Kirk was really kind of demonstrating how he sees schools in this kind of hierarchy of schools and who gets funding in Baltimore and who doesn't. And this is a more kind of pronounced example of this, but in other interviews, we see this as well, where students are comparing what they're dealing with on a daily basis to what their siblings are going through, or what friends either in Baltimore or in the county or elsewhere are going through, or maybe looking back from high school and seeing what they experienced in middle school or elementary school, and just seeing how it's not really consistent over time, that there is variation, that sometimes Students are able to learn in better facilities, and sometimes they're stuck in places that are kind of underfunded or have these kind of chronic conditions related to infrastructure that Josh has highlighted. And so I think building on something that Dr. Lofton and Larry, and I think all of us have been emphasizing, is that at the heart of these interviews and this work is not just talking to students to understand the problems that they face and the ways they kind of navigate schooling and their daily life more generally, but to see what solutions we might be able to generate or ways we can improve schooling and just what Baltimore is for young people in Baltimore more generally. And so one way of doing that in interviews is we ask a general question about, what's one thing you would change? What's one thing you would fix? Is there something I didn't ask about that's important to you? And that's where this kind of quote that we see here comes from, was at a very end of an interview, where one of those questions was asked, and the respondent ended by saying, can you please talk to the school to fix the toilet and to fix the building? And we have a good number of cases like this from across the interview so far, where students are really not just talking about, oh, this is unfortunate, I don't like this issue at my school, but really talking about how tangible and visceral these school infrastructure concerns can be in their daily experiences just trying to go to school and learn. And to that end as well, in terms of talking about solutions and possible ways to improve school infrastructure in Baltimore, something that stuck with our team a lot that we've talked about in conversations is this quote from 16-year-old Kiana. She says, if I would change, if I could change something, what would I change? I would try to change the people mindset. And she's basically talking about this idea that, and other things, she gives other examples of things that might be improved in Baltimore, but I think she gets at this broader change she wants to see in the school and in adults in Baltimore about what students really need, what students' experiences are like on a daily basis, what struggles and challenges they face, and that there needs to be kind of a mindset shift to kind of really grapple with the issues that are most salient and most important to students in their day-to-day lives. And I think this is back to you, Josh.
So I think right now, Josh, Larry, and myself, I think we should just have a conversation again and think about what we've just learned from the students, what we know when it comes to funding, what we know when we really go through the voices of students and parents, as many of us, as we have done. What are our steps in the call to action, right? And how do we prevent blaming people, when there's no resources?
So
right?
I think to first to get to that point is, one, we have to kind of figure out, what do we believe about Black children, right? What do we believe is important for Black children? And then how do we move out of this model of stability, and like, how do we move forward and do what just Kiana said? Like, how do we begin to change our mindset? And then also, how do we help young people to change their mindset? How do we help them to begin to think that they are important, right? And that they are needed, and that we do love them, right? So it's this work that we have to do on ourselves and in the institutions and spaces that we hold as adults and policymakers and doctors and whoever else, and then also creating that space for young people to grow and thrive. But I think it really is to start off with, what do we believe about Black children? What do we believe that Black children can do and be, and who they are?
Yeah, and building off that, Larry, because that's a great point about how we view Black children. And then also, like, right to the point about how Black children view themselves, throughout these interviews, right, we see the hopes and aspirations of these youth, right? And it emerges in a myriad of ways, right, where we see youth talking about, not just what they want to do with their careers, but what they want to do with their families, what they want to do with their hobbies and things like that, that they feel like structurally is not allowed, right? Because of this kind of structural and mundane violence that we talked about earlier, right? And in these ways that we still see, students are literally like not feeling well in the school because the structures are so bad. And so when we start thinking about, changing people's mindsets, right? We also need to think about how we change people's mindsets around structures, right? Mm-hmm. As those structures are fundamentally in place, or the structures are natural. These are not natural, right? These systems were built, right? And thus these systems can be destroyed. Mm-hmm. And so I think if we can start to encourage youth, because the youth are already headed that way, It's about us giving them the opportunity and the resources and the political education to, right, think about ways to dismantle these systems and these structures in ways in which that we can start to see Black thrival. So yeah.
No, beautiful. I just love this conversation. And I think you two are right on because, you know, with the research, we know that many of the students know many things about, or they perceive many things about how people see them, right? When you think about what they're encountering in school. And I think, Josh, when you said this whole idea of mundane violence that students are encountering, right? From the moment they wake up in the morning to the time they go to bed, you know, their walk to school and the conditions that they're in, you know, even in their home. But not only that, when they go to school, those conditions, but not only when they leave, right? The violence that they talk about. So it's not only this physical violence that many of us talk about often, but this intellectual violence that occur to really make our young people believe that they're not supposed to have resources, that they do not belong in healthy and safe schools, right? So I think we're right. We have to go back to the structure and we have to acknowledge the strange fruit that all of us are complicit in eating, right? And we're at a point in our research, after working so hard, that we can really come together and support each other. A lot of times when we talk about issues of race and racism, it causes division. It doesn't have to cause division. This is about loving people for being people, right? It's about not separating people because they see the world completely different than someone else see the world, right? So there's work on our end, I think, as policy experts and researchers, you know, we can really start talking about some real issues to empower people. And one of the things that I often hear, you know, and I think it's just so important for me to keep on saying it, is that students want three things. They want to be heard, they want to be loved, right? And they want to be supported.
Great. There is a question in the chat. Can you share some of the specific dreams of the students you've talked to?
When it comes to aspiration, so when it comes to aspiration, and anybody
Yeah,
can.
I'm sorry, Debbie, do you mind unmuting and clarifying that, please?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what questions you asked in the interview, so it's hard for me to ask, but some of you alluded to some of the dreams that you heard or things that students wanted in their lives. And I was wondering if you could share some of those.
Absolutely. So our young people have high aspirations. You know, it's so funny. I had an interview last week and they reminded me of Beyonce when she was on Star Search. And someone was asking her, what are your aspirations? And she said, I want to be happy. And I think we really need to think about that, not from a business point of view, but just think about how do we produce schools where our children are happy and safe, right? But another thing that I think that we sometimes do not know is that many of our young people have these high aspirations of becoming doctors or becoming lawyers. Psychologists is a big finding that we're finding in the research. And that goes once again to their understanding of mental health, right? And the issues that they're seeing with their own school member friends and you know, people that they are you know, seeing having some issues. And one of the questions that I ask is, you know, what's the percentage of students who are dealing with mental health issues, you think, from your school? And at first I thought it was going to be like, they'll say 10% or 20%, but I'm getting, oh, it's 100, it's 90%. So like, I take this work, and you probably all have seen a change in me because I take this work so seriously because I've been listening and fully engaging and humanizing our students in a way to show that they have high aspirations, they have goals, they're dealing with institutional issues for multi-generations, and they're trying to make sense of it. At the same time, knowing that a few mentors or a few psychologists, it's not going to bring that mind shift that needs to occur with state leaders, researchers, community members, so that we can provide them the space to thrive. All right.
I've got another question in the box really here. I think it was more of a comment, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. As a former teacher in city schools for 10 years, students have the same dreams as all other learners. They want to succeed in life. They want to become a first-generation graduate of high school or college freshman. They often express the desire to simply have the same chance as any other students in better schools. The majority of students feared failure simply because they have not witnessed enough success amongst their peers.
I would say that that even goes for that.
Yeah.
That's true, right? And then it also makes sometimes the success of their family as well, right? There's young people who are watching their parents stepping into college for the first time as adults, and as mom and dads, and are struggling, right? And then I'm in high school and I'm struggling too. So I'm watching my mom struggle in college. I'm on my way out the door. Is this what I want to do? Right? But we have to give young people options so that so they don't feel like they have to be pushed into a life of debt with going to college when that's not the place for them.
Mm-hmm. And I want to just add, the fear is all around too. We actually talk about students having fear, but many of us have fear. I have fear, right? To transgress the boundaries. How real and honest can I be as a researcher? Who's ready for it, right? So it's not just students in fear, but we're all connected, and we all are in fear of this weaponization because we go against the strange fruit, right? We're also, I see a question about communication, and thank you. So I think that's so wonderful, because I think communication and being able to hit multiple arenas with a unified message of love and social justice is so important. And that's what we're trying to do. So we encourage you to help us with that, because we know how important mass communication is, right? And we take it very seriously, because there's a narrative that would say we don't even belong doing what we are doing, but we want to squash that narrative. And just like our students need support, we love the support in order to help make sure that our policymakers and our thinkers stay committed to the research of empowering our young people and their families in Baltimore.
The chat said that we were allowed to just unmute ourselves. Can I unmute myself?
Absolutely.
Go for it.
Around that communication piece, I don't know if this is a question you have an answer to, but it's an empirical one that might be out there. I mean, has anybody ever successfully sued a school system for this kind of disproportionate financing that leads to the fundamentally, unconstitutional distribution of, inequitable wealth across the state?
Yes, absolutely. That's what were you going to say, Larry?
No.
Yeah, if you go back to the slide earlier, we kind of did that history of people fighting for that through law, right? And throughout the United States, we have a cause where it's adequacy. Our Constitution says thoroughly and efficient, but people have been using that over the years to try to ensure that we actually address the inequities in schools, and I believe that that if we frame our story in a way to show that this is not about causing harm to anyone, but actually empowering everyone to be successful, I think we'll do a better job, but it is that law case. But I want to go back to what the young people are saying. It's the mind shift that needs to change. And when that mind shift changes, you don't have to worry about our students not having good and healthy food, right? When that mind shift change, we don't have to worry about students being on a public bus because they'll have amazing buses to be on. When that mind shift change, there'll be investment in communities where recreational centers are needed, right? So we're battling not only through law, but an ideological fight, that we have to really think deeply about how we're going to address it. So that's a wonderful question.
Another really good question. There's two. I'll go ahead and read the first one. Are students involved in the policy work? Kind of speaking to our element of how we want to promote policy with our findings.
It's funny, Cherie and I actually side chatting about that.
We are.
We're having a side
we love
chat.
you, Cherie, by the way. You've been our supporter from the beginning.
I remember this.
We're having a whole side chat on that.
We love you.
But yes. Thanks for Cherie for bringing it up too. In our strategy groups, I mean, when we talk about community members and we talk about colleagues, we consider young people as our colleagues in this work, right? That they are a part of, like, we would have wasted all of you all's time if there was no young people involved in any of this work, right? We would have just wasted a whole hour and a half of everyone's time, like, and that would be keeping up with the status quo, though, right? That would be keeping up with how things are done and how things have been done. But we are on a mission to make sure that we are not doing to communities, we're doing to young people, but we're doing with young people, and we're doing with their families. I mean, when you think about it, when you look at the constant development of programs and the lack of success of some of those programs, they happen. Somebody with a big idea came up and dropped it in the neighborhood, but never talked to any of the young people there, right? But that organization got funded for work that they didn't do, right? Or not being connected, right? And so that's what we're trying, that's what we're pushing. So to another question I saw that Juliana had, we've already begun to get in front of those policymakers and those leaders and those decision makers. We're also in partnership with those folks that make those decisions and who have that money and who push out those funds. So yes, to your question. Cherie, you want to add something too?
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you, Larry. Thank you, Richard, everybody. Excellent work. But the reason I was sort of sidebarring with Larry is because as a classroom teacher, while we weren't suing school districts, we were very much influenced in policy and legislation as it pertained to issues that we were passionate about. I was a social studies teacher, and I was involved in something called Project Citizen, which ultimately took me all over the world in terms of not managing, but implementing projects that influence policy. This is why I asked, because there are so many things that are available that can really magnify the voice of students in this work. And Baltimore City students are just primed for it. To have a voice, it would be awesome to see that.
And we have connected with those. And so, like, we are not the folks, but we've connected with the organizations who have those young people who are doing that work, right? Like Heart Smiles, Youth as Resources, like we're connected with those folks and helping to push the work that they're doing. Just like with the fund's transportation report, they are part of our work, our transportation strategy group. And, trying to really support folks in a space where, I mean, when you think about it, youth programming and organizations that are pretty much run by BIPOC folks don't really have evaluation and data to really support the work that they do, right? You can't afford it, right? Evaluation is expensive when you are a mom and pop program really about pushing young people. And so we've been able to kind of connect and support those folks in that work.
And we also, a little secret that we should just let out, we will have a docu-series as well. Josh, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and so
sorry for letting it out.
we were gonna do a surprise drop of the trailer, but now we'll go ahead and let it out. But no, we are really excited to work with a group of Black women-led documentarians who are really going to take our data and really provide an opportunity for youth to share their experiences across multiple platforms. So kind of returning to the question around communication, how do we get these policies out, these interventions out, right? The experiences out, right? Our goal is to tell, the stories through the strategy group stories, right? Through the lens of these youth who have already participated and who have already shared, and give them also the creative content skills, right? To produce these type of things and kind of be, their own sort of like producers, right? The directors of their own lives and how that's being told. And again, we're going to tell that through a docu-series, and also, that audio and visual evidence will also be displayed across multiple platforms. So hopefully, you might see a TikTok of nobody asked me. So we're really excited about the potential for this project. So yes.
Yeah. Yeah, we're really thinking, and if anyone else have any suggestions, we would love to hear more, but it's really about connecting. We believe and we want to encourage others that we have the opportunity, right, to use our privilege in ways to uncover the strange truth that our students are experiencing every single day. And by talking to them, by loving them and respecting their voices, we actually will understand better about this strange fruit. Also, not only must we think about the strange fruit our students are encountering, but we want to support the strange fruit that we see in institutions, and areas that prevent many of our leaders from leading in a way to humanize Baltimoreans. And so it's moving beyond just academia, but making sure we work with policymakers, we work with experts, we work with community members, we work with interagencies to make sure that we have a united understanding of what we're dealing with and the best way to address it without blaming institutions or people who are in powerful positions and institutions, right? And I think this is so important because the thing is about Baltimore is that oftentimes Baltimoreans, as well as others, always want to place blame on Baltimore. But there's a deep-seated history that we must uncover, and that connects to our main point of bearing strange fruit. But not only that, we want to say, in order to do this work when it comes to humanizing people, right? Because that's what we're doing. We're showing that they're loving, caring, wonderful individuals. That we want to make sure that you have different representations, different ideologies, different ways of thinking in order to really co-produce knowledge and actually address solutions. The problem, I think, often, it puts us in very uncomfortable situations because you have to question some of the basic common sense that you thought in order to make sense of the world. We're in a point right now in our research where we have opened ourselves up to be vulnerable to ensure that we get multiple viewpoints at the same time of supporting people in the different areas that they are in. Larry? Mute. Unmute.
Sorry. And so the recommendations that we have thus far is that we want to make sure that we're creating these innovative strategies and interventions for new funding methods, new ways of funding, new ways of thinking about how we allocate funds for infrastructure and for school programming. We also want to develop a formula that addresses the equity and injustices so that we can fulfill the educational and constitutional promise, a promise of a thorough and efficient education. And so our research, like we kind of got into the conversation earlier, that we've already began to get in front of different groups of leadership. We've been in front of city Senate delegation. We've also been in front of the state delegation as well. We're sharing the findings around the infrastructure and then also supporting some of the most recent bills that have just gone through. The strategy groups are using the data to work together to create new formulas that will promote an equitable distribution of funds for our schools.
And also, we just want to say thank you. Thank you to the people who've been really supporting us. It's been a journey. It's been a very great intellectual journey for me. And so we have so many people to thank. We want to thank people who were on our team that are no longer on our team, went to other places, and there's several. And we're excited that we can say thank you to them because they contribute greatly to this work. Many of you all know Larry and I had a dream of sharing this idea of co-creating knowledge. And to see that we're at this position, this point now, where we can use our privileges in order to empower people in Baltimore, we are ecstatic. So every struggle, every tear, everything we had to get to this place, it is so okay with us because we believe that change must come from within, and then from within, you can actually change certain policies and implementations. I mean, and implement good implementations to empower people. But thank you, Baltimore. We also have a special thanks to Tina. I don't know if Tina's here, but many of the people in the cabinet with Baltimore City Public Schools, we want to thank them because they have opened up doors. We've had multiple conversations, and I believe that they really are looking for meaningful partnerships where we can support each other. And Tina's just a perfect example. And also Dr. Durant as well, who's just been amazing. Anyone else, Larry?
Everybody, this has been a journey. We're not finished. We still have a lot of work to do. But this has been exciting to get to this point. So I just, we have an amazing team, and I'm just really blessed. We're really blessed to have the support of everyone who's here today and our team. So thanks.
All right. All right.
Do we open the floor up or?
Any questions? Feedback?
I just wanted to say real quick, thank you for inviting me to this. I feel like I've been kind of a peripheral member of the team for a while, and it's really nice to get to kind of circle back and hear all the great things that are going on. I mean, for me as a research administrator, kind of when we get in the minutia of that, sometimes it feels very frustrating, but then to hear about the wonderful things that are going on in the real world is just very gratifying to me. So thank you again for inviting me. It's been a joy to watch y'all present.
Thank you. Thank you, Juliet, for stepping in and just being so supportive with so many things.
This is a great question. What are your next steps and what kind of help and support will you need?
Aaron, answer that question.
So our next steps, we will be presenting our findings through our strategy groups. So we've implemented and instituted strategy groups, which key together academics, policymakers, local leaders, political leaders, and policymakers with data that we have derived, that we have come up with, and we're giving it to them so that they can start generating real, salient, tangible, and actionable, as well as measurable. Got to throw out a shout out to the teachers in the room on specific steps that can help our participants. And we'll be presenting these at our symposium, which will be in April. We are also working as you've seen with Dr. Sharfstein, we've been working with the School of Public Health in order for their basically data that they're looking at infrastructure within Baltimore City Schools and how to improve it. We have a lot of things going on our table. We are doing a data analysis, we're reviewing, we're writing, and anyone who stops and listens to us, we'll talk to them. And we're also collecting interviews right now. We're 2/3 done. I mean, today's data showed 98 interviews. We broke 101 like yesterday. So we're almost there. Woohoo. If you know anyone who's a Baltimore City Schools student or parent of a Baltimore City Schools student, please have them email us and please have them contact us. Someone will put the email in there as well. So on that note, Dorothy, you would like to speak. So go ahead, Dorothy.
Well, this was a fabulous seminar, and all the work that you've done, terrific. I'm a member of the Hopkins Academy from East Baltimore, and we've been working with Henderson Hopkins a lot, which is, I won't say part of the Baltimore City school system because you wouldn't recognize it as a Baltimore City school if you're familiar with the physical plant. So it's really overly endowed, shall we say. So at this point, where is the Kerwin Commission with all this? Is that done, and is it now up to the locals to get the funding for the Baltimore City schools that is needed to implement so many of these programs? What can we do all these old folks that don't have anything else to do, can we advocate? Can we, write to our local folks or to the state folks that are, the ones with the money?
Well, is Josh Sharp, Dr. Sharpsheen, is he still here? Because I think he will be a great person to actually answer that question. Larry, do you want to go first? And then
I was going to say, like, on the programmatic side, there have been some funds that have made it to schools around like social emotional health, the concentrated poverty funds. And so some of those programmatic funds have begun to make it into schools. And plus with the COVID, with COVID, there's been more put on top of that. But it's still a lot of work that's still happening to get that, to get things moving.
Right. And we want to make sure that we have data to really support humanizing our students so they can have school environments where they feel like they belong and they feel loved and cared by our city and our state. So we want to keep that mission. In any way you can help us with getting that out, people who are supporting that idea of love to people, we want to work with you to make sure that we really have a campaign of equity and love and justice. And that's what the Nobody Asked Me campaign is all about. I'm not quite sure on what right now is going on. I need to check with some people to get that answer. I think Josh, Dr. Sharpsheen will be great at really answering that question, but I know that there's so much more that we need to do. And we want to be this research engine that really highlight the experiences so that we can show our young people that we love, we care, and they belong within Baltimore schools, and they don't have to go anywhere else. They can grow up and they can stay in Baltimore and they can feel comfortable and safe and thrive. Thank you for that question.
Richard, may I say something?
Absolutely.
I just want to say thank you for a phenomenal presentation and for all the hard work that you've done. I mean, you've not just done, some work by yourself. You brought people together and various constituent groups together. You brought the community together. You brought the local community together, the research community together, students, policymakers, and I think this is phenomenal. And I just wish you the best as you continue. And I also wanted to say, as I was listening to you, your work reminds me of the work of Pedro Noguera and just so how involved it is. And so I just want to say thank you publicly.
Thank you. That means a lot. Thank you. Thank you. All right, Larry, I mean, is there any other questions or feedback? All right, Larry, you can take us home.
So I just wanted to, again, wanted to thank everybody again for their time and for supporting. We, again, like I said, have a lot more work to do. I'm really looking forward to seeing everyone April the 27th from 9 to 2 at the Glass Pavilion for our symposium. But this has really been an exciting last 2 years on this work. And thanks for being so supportive.
Yeah, thank you all. Have a great day.